Okay, so get ready for something interesting. Today, we're going deep on how those fairy tales, the ones we all grew up with, can actually, believe it or not, make us better strategic thinkers.
It really is fascinating, isn't it, how these stories, these simple stories that we often dismiss as, well, just for kids, they actually hold these profound insights, into strategy, into human nature, into the way the world works.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like they've been right there in front of us this whole time. And the book we're diving into, Once Upon a Map, it just nails it.
Yeah.
It uses this thing, Wardley mapping, to kind of unlock these like hidden layers, these strategic depths within these classic fairy tales.
Wordly mapping, and I think it's worth explaining briefly for those who might not be familiar, but it's basically a way to visualize systems and strategies. It's like, imagine a map, but instead of plotting like physical locations, we're plotting elements of a business, a project, or in this case, a fairy tale. And what that does is it allows us to see not just where things are, but how they connect, how far along they are in their development, and how those relationships, those connections might change over time.
Yeah, it's like you suddenly have this X-ray vision for your strategy, which is super cool. And I think what I love most about Once Upon a Map is how it uses these fairy tales, which again, they could be kind of abstract, to make these concepts totally relatable.
Exactly. And it's amazing how well they work, these metaphors. Like take the three little pigs, right? I mean, on the surface, it's just a story about, well, three pigs building houses and, oh yeah, there's a hungry wolf.
Right. But when you look closer, you see this really clear picture of a value chain playing out, right?
Right.
Each pig is making choices, making decisions about what resources to use, how much time to invest, and ultimately, how resilient they want their house to be, when that wolf shows up.
Exactly. The straw house, for example, I mean, that represents a quick and easy solution. And
Yeah.
sure, it might work in the short term, but it's vulnerable, right? I mean, it's not going to hold up when the wolf actually appears.
Right. And then you have the brick house, which, yeah, it requires a much bigger upfront investment. It takes more time, more resources, but it stands firm, right? It highlights this core principle of strategic foresight, of building something that lasts, that can withstand those inevitable challenges, those wolves we all face. And on the Wardley map, you can actually see that, right? How the brick house sits differently because of its inherent strength, its robust construction.
And you know what? The book actually says it really well. They say, strong foundations matter, especially when wolves are at the door. And I love that. Each story, each fairy tale, it offers these little nuggets of wisdom, these memorable lines that just like really make the concept stick.
Totally, totally. And you know what? I think that's a perfect transition, actually, to our next fairy tale, our next little deep dive here, which is Hansel and Gretel. Because if the three little pigs teach us about building strong foundations, Hansel and Gretel, they throw us right into this idea of adaptation, right? I mean, we've all been there, haven't we? Lost in the woods, so to speak, trying to find our way, make sense of things. And Hansel and Gretel, right, their little breadcrumb strategy, it's clever, sure, at first, but it ultimately backfires, doesn't it?
Yeah, it really highlights this crucial aspect of adaptation, right?
Yeah.
What works in one context at one specific point in time, well, it might not be a sustainable solution in the long run. The breadcrumbs, they're like this static approach in the environment. Well, it's dynamic. It's changing all the time.
Right. Like they were so busy looking back, marking where they'd been, that they forgot to, actually look ahead, see where they were going.
Precisely. And, on a Wordly map, you can visualize that. You can see this evolution from something being unique to becoming commonplace, like the witch's house,
Yeah.
right? Initially, it's custom built. It's one of a kind. But over time, it could easily become, well, commoditized. Like, remember those gingerbread house kits you talked about earlier?
Yeah, yeah, it's true. Okay, so then that brings us to this interesting question, doesn't it? Like, how do we even recognize when our own breadcrumbs are starting to get outdated? What are the warning signs, the signals that it's time to maybe shift gears, adapt, and evolve our approach?
That's a great question, a really important one. And I'd say one key indicator, one thing to really watch out for, is when a solution, something that once felt innovative, even groundbreaking, well, when it starts to become the norm, the expected, that's a sign, like that podcasting software you mentioned earlier,
Oh,
right?
yeah. I mean, what I was using way back when, it wouldn't even get me off the ground now. I'd be sunk. It'd be like, it's like trying to, I don't know, build a car using only bicycle parts. You might get rolling for a little bit, but you're going to hit a wall eventually.
Exactly. And that's where this Hansel and Gretel mindset, but with a proactive spin, that's where it gets really powerful. We have to constantly be scanning the horizon, anticipating those changes, and being willing to leave those outdated breadcrumbs behind.
Speaking of, well, adapting to a changing landscape, Once Upon a Map, they actually tackle these dynamics of competition, these market forces, and they do it with, get this, Cinderella.
Cinderella, right? The ultimate underdog story. But they reimagine her as this savvy entrepreneur, someone who's actually disrupting an established market. It's brilliant.
Really is. It's like she's not just sitting around waiting for a prince anymore, right? She's like a budding shoe designer, ready
Yeah.
to like take on the world. And those stepsisters, her stepmother, they represent that old way of doing things, the competition that's threatened by her fresh perspective.
Involved, right? It's cleverly portrayed as a trade show where Cinderella gets to show off her unique product, or, well, her glass slipper.
Talk about a showstopper, that glass slipper, it becomes this ultimate symbol, right, of differentiation, standing out from the crowd in a crowded market. Makes you think, what's my glass slipper? What's that thing that makes me unique, that helps me stand out?
Exactly. And, it's important to Cinderella's success, it doesn't hinge solely on, the fairy godmother's magic. The fairy godmother, she's more like a mentor or maybe an investor, someone who sees Cinderella's potential, believes in her, and provides some guidance and support.
Which, I mean, that circles back to the importance of having a strong network, right? Surrounding yourself with people who get you, who believe in your vision.
Absolutely. And Cinderella's story, it reminds us that even when things seem impossible, like there's no way out, with the right mix of talent, of strategy, and, yeah, maybe a little bit of magic, you can disrupt the status quo, make amazing things happen.
Now, if we're talking about bold moves, taking a chance, and maybe a little bit of magic, I mean, we got to talk about Jack and the Beanstalk,
Yeah.
right? That story, it always gets me thinking about risk and, how we make decisions when the outcome, it's totally uncertain.
Oh, yeah, Jack's story, it's like a masterclass in calculated risk-taking.
Yeah.
Every choice he makes, from trading that cow for those magic beans to, actually climbing that beanstalk, it comes with its own set of, well, potential rewards and consequences, right?
And in Once Upon a Map, you can really see how those choices, they come to life. On the Wardley map, it's like you're tracing the path of his decisions, each one pushing him further and further into this, like, uncharted territory.
Precisely. When you map out Jack's choices, it's just so clear. It's visualization of risk, of evolution.
Yeah.
Those magic beans, for example, they represent something, well, completely new, totally untested. They'd be way over on, like, the left side of the map, in the, what do they call it, the Genesis stage.
Which is usually where, the biggest risks are lurking, but also potentially the biggest payoffs, right? I mean, it's a trade-off.
Absolutely. But it's important to, it's key to remember that Jack's story, it isn't about throwing caution to the wind, right? He's not just being reckless.
Yeah.
Jack, he's taking the calculated risk, right? He's looking at the situation, assessing things, and then, he's making a strategic decision based on, well, on what he knows at the time.
Yeah, it's like he's the poker player who knows when to hold 'em, knows when to fold 'em. It's that element of, like, strategy, of calculated decision-making that elevates it beyond just, well, dumb luck, right?
Exactly. And that's what's so great about Once Upon a Map, It encourages us to think like Jack, to not be afraid to take chances, to be strategic about it, to, like, map out our own beanstalks, to recognize that, yeah, there could be rewards, but there can also be, well, consequences.
Which brings us back to that core idea of Wardley mapping, doesn't it? It's not about pretending risks don't exist, but about, understanding them, seeing them clearly, and then, well, ultimately making better, more informed decisions.
Precisely. And, these fairy tales, they're more than just stories. When you combine them with a tool like Wardley Mapping, they give us this framework, and suddenly strategy, it's not so intimidating anymore. It's not this big scary thing. It can be as engaging, as thought-provoking as a story we've known, well, since we were kids.
Totally. So as we, start to wrap up our deep dive here into Once Upon a Map, what's the big takeaway? What do you really want our listeners to walk away with today?
That even something as, well, as familiar as a fairy tale, something we think we know, it can unlock these new ways of thinking, these new dimensions of strategic thinking. It's amazing. Whether it's, building a strong foundation like the Three Little Pigs, adapting to change like Hansel and Gretel, or maybe, disrupting the market, shaking things up like Cinderella, or even, taking a calculated risk like our friend Jack. These stories, they offer these timeless lessons, this wisdom that we can use in our own lives, in our careers. It's incredible.
It really is. And by, Combining those classic lessons with something like Wardley mapping, something so powerful. It's like, well, we can change the entire game, right? The way we approach problems, the way we make decisions, and ultimately write our own success stories. It's amazing. Who knew fairy tales could be so useful, so practical?
Right. It's fantastic. So I'm going to leave our listeners with one final thought to, chew on. What if you took some time to map out your own life, your goals, your challenges, your own, dare I say, your own personal fairy tale? What would it look like? What would your magic beans be? Your glass slipper? That path to, well, to your own happily ever after?
Ah, that's fantastic. That's something I'm going to be thinking about for a while, I think. I might need to go find a giant map and get to work.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for this. This has been amazing. Such an eye-opening deep dive. Really appreciate it.
It's been my pleasure, truly. Always a joy to explore these ideas, especially with you.